Richard Whitmore believed grief belonged only to the people rich enough to protect it, but the quiet woman kneeling beside his son's grave was about to destroy that illusion forever. The winter wind swept through St. Gabriel Memorial Cemetery, rattling the bare oak branches above rows of polished marble headstones worth more than most people's monthly rent. Black umbrellas drifted across the hill like silent shadows, while distant church bells echoed through the cold gray morning. Every year on December 14th, Richard Whitmore came here alone. No assistants, no interviews, no board meetings. Just a billionaire father visiting the grave of the only person he had ever truly loved. At 57, Richard carried wealth the way soldiers carried old scars, heavily and without peace. His tailored charcoal overcoat fit perfectly against his broad shoulders, and his polished black shoes pressed into the damp grass as he walked toward the towering white headstone engraved with the name Ethan Whitmore. 12 years old. Beloved son. Gone too soon. The entire city knew the story. Newspapers had mourned alongside him. Television stations had replayed funeral footage for weeks. Donations poured into children's hospitals. Politicians attended memorial galas in Ethan's honor. But none of those things touched the silence that waited for Richard every time he stood in front of that grave. For 6 years, he had replayed the same regret inside his mind. One business trip, one postponed flight, one missed hospital visit. The final phone call from his son still haunted him like a wound that never healed. Richard tightened his jaw and climbed the final stone steps toward the private Whitmore family section when he suddenly stopped cold. Someone was already there. A woman in a faded beige coat knelt beside Ethan's grave, carefully brushing dead leaves away from the marble with trembling fingers. Her long blonde hair moved softly in the wind, and beside her sat a small bouquet of white roses tied together with a pale blue ribbon. Richard's expression darkened instantly. The cemetery was supposed to be private this morning. His security team had arranged it personally. Yet this stranger stood only inches away from his son's grave as though she belonged there. Then the woman whispered something so softly that Richard almost missed it. "I missed you, sweetheart." The billionaire froze mid-step. A sharp pulse of anger surged through his chest. Sweetheart. His son was not some public memory for strangers to romanticize. Richard had seen this before over the years. Obsessed followers. Curious reporters pretending to mourn. Opportunists looking for sympathy or money. People fascinated by tragedy because it belonged to someone famous. But this felt different somehow, and that only made him angrier. The woman gently placed her hand against the cold marble as tears slid silently down her cheeks. She looked completely unaware that Richard Whitmore himself was standing 20 feet away watching her. The cemetery suddenly felt unnaturally still. Even the wind seemed to quiet around them. Richard descended the final steps slowly, his polished shoes striking stone with controlled force. "Excuse me," he said sharply. The woman startled and quickly stood, clutching the bouquet tightly against her chest. Up close, she looked ordinary. Late 30s maybe. No makeup. No jewelry beyond a thin silver bracelet around her wrist. Her eyes widened slightly as she recognized him, but instead of panic, something else crossed her face. Sadness. Deep, unbearable sadness. Richard's voice turned colder. "Who are you?" The woman swallowed carefully. "My name is Clara. And why exactly are you at my son's grave?" Clara's fingers tightened around the roses. For a brief moment, it looked like she wanted to answer honestly. But whatever truth lived behind her eyes seemed trapped there. "I just came to visit him," she whispered. Richard let out a humorless laugh. "Visit him?" His voice echoed across the empty cemetery. "You knew Ethan?" Clara nodded slowly. Richard studied her face with growing suspicion. He had memorized every person connected to his son's final months. Doctors, nurses, teachers, family friends. Yet he had never seen this woman before in his life. The silence stretched painfully between them. Then Richard noticed something near the base of the grave. A tiny hand-drawn picture tucked beside the flowers. Crayon stars. A little boy holding hands with a woman under a blue sky. And written at the bottom in uneven child handwriting were the words, "Thank you for staying with me." Richard Whitmore stared at the childish drawing as though the paper itself had suddenly become dangerous. The winter air pressed cold against his face, but he barely felt it anymore. His eyes remained fixed on the uneven crayon stars and the tiny figures holding hands beneath a bright blue sky. Ethan had drawn this. Richard recognized the shaky little loops in his son's handwriting instantly. 6 years had passed since the funeral, yet a father never forgot the way his child wrote the word dad or colored outside the lines. But the woman in the drawing was not Ethan's mother, and she certainly was not anyone Richard recognized. Clara noticed his expression change and immediately stepped forward, reaching carefully for the picture. "Please," she said softly, "do not throw it away." Richard's jaw tightened. "Throw it away?" His voice sharpened with disbelief. "You leave personal items at my son's grave and expect me to what exactly?" "Appreciate it." Clara lowered her eyes. The wind lifted strands of blonde hair across her pale face while she clutched the bouquet tighter against her chest. "I never meant to upset you." "Then you should not have come here." The words landed harder than Richard intended, but grief had a way of turning pain into cruelty before a person realized what they were saying. Clara nodded once as if she believed she deserved the humiliation. That only irritated him more. People who played innocent often did. Yet something about her silence felt painfully genuine. No manipulation. No dramatic excuses. Just sadness. Deep and exhausted sadness. Richard glanced again at the drawing near the headstone. "How did you get this?" Clara hesitated. For a moment, her lips parted as though the truth sat right there waiting to escape. But instead she whispered, "He gave it to me." Richard felt a pulse of anger climb his chest. "That is impossible." His voice echoed across the cemetery louder now. "My son did not know you." Clara looked at him then. Really looked at him. And the expression in her watery blue eyes carried something far worse than fear. Pity. The billionaire suddenly hated that look more than anything. "You are wrong," she said quietly. "Ethan knew me very well." The cemetery fell silent again. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang once through the gray morning fog. Richard took a step closer. "I was with my son every day during his treatment." Clara's face twitched almost invisibly. "No," she replied gently. "You were not." The words hit Richard like ice water. His expression hardened instantly. "Excuse me." Clara's trembling fingers brushed against the silver bracelet on her wrist before she looked away toward Ethan's grave. "He waited for you many nights." Richard's breathing slowed dangerously. "You do not know anything about my family." "I know he was scared." Her voice cracked softly now. "I know he pretended to be brave because he did not want his mother crying. I know he hated the hospital pudding and loved astronomy books. I know he slept with the hallway light on because darkness made him anxious after the treatments." Richard froze completely. The blood drained slowly from his face. Those details had never been public. Not once. Ethan's fear of darkness had remained private even within the family. Doctors barely knew about it. For the first time since approaching her, uncertainty slipped into Richard Whitmore's eyes. Clara wiped a tear from her cheek and continued staring at the grave instead of him. "Every year I come here because I promised him I would." Richard struggled to find words. His polished image of control suddenly felt unstable beneath him, like thin ice beginning to crack. "Who are you?" he asked again, but this time the question sounded smaller. Clara swallowed hard. "Someone who loved your son." Richard opened his mouth to respond when footsteps approached behind them. One of the cemetery caretakers hurried nervously up the stone path, holding his cap against the wind. "Mr. Whitmore," the older man said carefully. "I am sorry to interrupt, sir, but Miss Bennet has been visiting this grave every month for years." Even the cold wind disappeared into silence. Then Clara slowly bent down beside the grave again and placed the white roses carefully beneath Ethan's name. Hidden underneath the bouquet was something Richard had not noticed before. An old hospital bracelet with Ethan Whitmore printed across the faded plastic. Richard Whitmore stared at the faded hospital bracelet as though it carried the weight of every mistake he had spent 6 years trying not to remember. The thin plastic band rested beside the white roses beneath Ethan's grave, weathered by time, but unmistakably real. Ethan Whitmore. St. Matthew Children's Hospital. Oncology Wing. Richard felt his throat tighten painfully. He remembered fastening that bracelet around his son's tiny wrist the morning treatment began. Ethan had joked that it looked like a cheap amusement park ticket. Richard had laughed back then, back when he still believed money could solve every problem placed in front of him. Clara slowly stepped away from the grave, giving him space he did not deserve. The cemetery caretaker quietly excused himself, sensing the tension settling over the hill like fog. Richard barely noticed him leave. His attention remained locked on the bracelet and the woman standing a few feet away with tears trembling in her eyes. "Where did you get this?" he finally asked, though deep down he already feared the answer. Clara folded her arms against the cold wind. "Ethan gave it to me the night before his surgery." Richard shook his head immediately. No, the denial came fast and automatic, like a reflex protecting him from something unbearable. "That cannot be true." Clara's expression did not change. "It is." Richard took a slow breath, fighting the pressure building behind his ribs. "My wife and I were with him before every surgery." Clara looked down at the frozen grass beneath her boots. Not the last one. The silence that followed felt enormous. Richard remembered that week clearly now. The emergency board meeting in Chicago. The investors threatening to pull out of the merger. The private jet waiting on the runway while Ethan slept inside a hospital room 3 states away. Richard had promised his son he would return before the operation. He had truly believed he would. But weather delays turned into interviews. Interviews became negotiations. Negotiations became another missed night. By the time he arrived back at St. Matthew's Hospital, Ethan was already unconscious. Richard swallowed hard as the memory hit him with brutal clarity. Clara carefully brushed tears from her cheeks before speaking again. "He waited for you until almost 2 in the morning." Richard closed his eyes briefly. The cemetery suddenly felt colder. "How do you know that?" Clara hesitated. Her fingers tightened around the sleeves of her old beige coat. "Because I stayed with him." Richard opened his eyes again slowly. "Stayed with him how?" Clara looked toward Ethan's grave, and when she answered, her voice carried the quiet exhaustion of someone who had been grieving alone for years. "I volunteered on the pediatric floor every Thursday night. Reading books mostly. Keeping kids company when their parents needed rest." Richard felt something inside him shift uncomfortably. He remembered nurses mentioning volunteers once or twice during Ethan's treatment, but those details had blurred together beneath meetings, specialists, travel schedules, and endless attempts to maintain control over a situation he could not fix. Clara continued softly. "Ethan liked astronomy books. He used to ask me questions about stars because he thought space sounded less scary than hospitals." Richard's jaw tightened again. Ethan had loved astronomy since he was 6 years old. His bedroom ceiling once glowed with tiny plastic constellations. Richard had installed them himself one Christmas Eve after returning from a business trip late at night. For a brief second, he could almost hear Ethan's laughter echoing through memory. Clara slowly knelt beside the grave again and touched the edge of the marble headstone with trembling fingers. The night before surgery, he could not sleep. Richard remained completely still. He kept asking if his dad was coming. The words landed like a knife, twisting quietly beneath polished skin. Clara swallowed hard before continuing. At around 1:30 in the morning, he finally stopped asking. Richard looked away toward the distant cemetery gates because suddenly he could not bear the shame rising behind his eyes. Wolf had taught him how to command rooms, close billion-dollar deals, and silence criticism with power. But none of those things mattered here. Not beside a 12-year-old boy buried beneath cold marble. Clara reached into the pocket of her coat and carefully removed something small wrapped in tissue paper. "I should have given this to you years ago," she whispered. Richard stared as she unfolded the paper slowly, revealing a tiny silver compass no bigger than a quarter. His breath caught instantly. Ethan had carried that compass everywhere during treatment. Richard had bought it at an airport gift shop during one of his rushed trips home. On the back, tiny engraved words reflected weakly beneath the gray winter sky. "So you always find your way home." Richard's hands trembled as Clara held the compass out toward him. "He wanted you to have it after." Her voice broke completely then. "But he made me promise not to give it to you unless you were ready to hear the truth about those final weeks." Richard Whitmore stared at the tiny silver compass resting in Clara's trembling hand, and for the first time in years, the billionaire felt something far more terrifying than grief. He felt uncertainty. The winter sky above St. Gabriel Memorial Cemetery darkened slowly as heavy clouds rolled over the city, swallowing what little sunlight remained. Cold winds swept across the hill, carrying dead leaves over polished marble and frozen grass, but neither of them moved. Richard's eyes remained fixed on the engraved words etched into the compass Ethan once carried everywhere during treatment. "So you always find your way home." He remembered buying it during a rushed layover in Denver after canceling yet another weekend with his son. Ethan had smiled like it was treasure worth millions. Richard had forgotten that moment until now. Clara slowly lowered her hand when Richard still did not take the compass. Beside his bed every night, she whispered. Richard swallowed hard. His throat burned unexpectedly. You were there that often? Clara nodded faintly. Almost every Thursday. The billionaire struggled to understand how an entire person could exist inside his son's life without him noticing. He had hired the best specialists in the country. Private nurses, security, tutors, drivers. Entire hospital wings carried the Whitmore family name because of his donations. Yet somehow this quiet woman in a faded coat had become part of Ethan's final memories, while Richard remained a distant figure arriving between meetings and interviews. Clara carefully wrapped the compass back inside the tissue paper. He did not want you to feel guilty. Richard let out a bitter laugh under his breath. That seems impossible now. Clara looked at him softly. Children protect the people they love more than adults realize. The words settled heavily between them. Richard suddenly remembered one particular night 6 years earlier. Ethan had been weak from treatment, barely able to keep his eyes open, but when Richard apologized for missing another hospital dinner, his son smiled and said, "It is okay, Dad. You are busy saving the world." At the time, Richard believed the boy understood sacrifice. Standing here now, he wondered if Ethan had simply learned how to hide disappointment. The realization hollowed something inside him. Clara turned toward the grave again. He used to count the hours until you called. Richard closed his eyes briefly. Every sentence she spoke felt painfully specific, the kind of truth impossible to invent. Why are you telling me all this now? He asked quietly. Clara's expression shifted. Sadness deepened behind her eyes like old wounds reopening. Because he asked me to wait. Richard frowned. Wait for what? Clara hesitated. Then she slowly reached into her coat pocket again and removed something else. A small cassette tape inside a clear plastic case worn cloudy with age. Richard stared at it in confusion. What is that? Clara's fingers trembled around the tape. Ethan recorded it 3 days before he passed away. The cemetery seemed to go completely silent. Even the wind disappeared. Richard felt his pulse quicken painfully beneath his collar. A recording? Clara nodded. He wanted you to hear it one day. Richard's eyes locked onto the cassette, as if it might suddenly explode in his hands. Why did nobody give this to me? Clara lowered her gaze. Because Ethan changed his mind. Richard's voice sharpened slightly. What does that mean? Clara inhaled slowly, fighting emotion before answering. The last time he spoke about it, he told me not to give it to you unless you were finally ready to stop running from the truth. Richard felt those words hit harder than anything else that morning. The truth. Wealthy men like Richard Whitmore built entire empires avoiding uncomfortable truths. That was how survival worked at the top. Control the narrative. Control perception. Control pain before pain controlled you. But standing beside his son's grave, none of those instincts protected him anymore. Clara carefully held the cassette toward him. I tried to come here before, she admitted softly. 3 years ago, then again last winter. But every time I saw cameras around you or people treating Ethan's memory like a public monument, her voice broke slightly. I could not do it. Richard looked away in shame. She was right. Ethan's death had become charity dinners, interviews, glossy magazine covers about perseverance and healing. Meanwhile, the most important parts of the boy's final months had apparently lived in hidden conversations no reporter ever heard. Clara wiped another tear from her cheek. He did not need a billionaire during those nights. Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. He needed his father. Richard froze completely. The words struck with brutal precision because deep down he had already known they were true. Clara slowly stepped backward from the grave, giving him space again. There is a tape player inside the caretaker's office, she said quietly. If you are finally ready to hear him. Richard Whitmore had spent 6 years avoiding the sound of hospital machines in his memories, but nothing prepared him for the trembling voice waiting inside that old cassette tape. Caretaker's office sat near the back gates of St. Gabriel Memorial Cemetery, a small brick building warmed by yellow lamps and the faint smell of coffee that had been left sitting too long on a burner. Rain tapped softly against the windows as Richard stood motionless beside an old wooden desk, staring at the cassette player in front of him like it held the power to destroy whatever remained of his carefully controlled world. Clara waited silently near the doorway, her hands folded tightly together inside the sleeves of her coat. She had not pressured him to press play. She did not need to. The tape itself already carried the weight of unfinished grief. Richard slowly sat down in the creaking chair, the silver compass still resting heavily inside his coat pocket. His fingers trembled slightly as he slid the cassette into the machine. For a moment, nothing happened except the low mechanical click of old plastic locking into place. Then static crackled softly through the tiny speaker. Richard's breathing stopped. A child's weak voice filled the room. Hi, Dad." Richard froze instantly. Ethan sounded smaller than he remembered. Fragile. Tired. The kind of tired no child should ever sound. The billionaire gripped the edge of the desk as the recording continued. Clara said maybe recording stuff helps people say things better. A faint nervous laugh followed. Richard shut his eyes. He could picture Ethan perfectly now. Thin hospital blanket. Oversized socks with little rockets on them. Pale cheeks trying to smile through exhaustion. The tape crackled again before Ethan continued softly. "I know you are busy, and I know important people need you a lot." Richard lowered his head slowly into one shaking hand. Every word felt unbearable because Ethan still sounded proud of him. "But I wanted to tell you something in case." The boy stopped there for several seconds. Richard heard faint beeping machines in the background. Distant hospital sounds. Nurses passing through hallways. Clara looked down quietly, tears forming in her eyes as she listened again to a recording she had probably replayed alone countless nights. Ethan finally spoke again, more quietly this time. "Sometimes when it gets dark in here, I get scared." Richard's chest tightened painfully. Not because of dying exactly. Ethan swallowed hard on the recording. "I just get scared of being by myself." The room fell completely silent except for the tape spinning softly inside the player. Richard felt tears burn behind his eyes for the first time in years. He had convinced himself Ethan died surrounded by support, comfort, and world-class care. But now another truth emerged slowly from the shadows. His son had been lonely. Deeply lonely. Ethan's voice continued. "Clara stays when the nightmares happen." Richard looked up sharply toward Clara, but she kept her eyes lowered, almost ashamed to hear herself mentioned. "She reads me astronomy books even when I already know the facts," Ethan whispered with a weak laugh. "And she lets me ask questions nobody else likes answering." Richard's breathing became uneven. The tape crackled softly again before Ethan spoke one sentence that shattered whatever defenses remained inside his father. "Dad always says he is coming soon, but Clara is the one who actually stays." Richard's face collapsed completely then. He turned away instinctively, covering his mouth as emotion finally broke through years of controlled silence. Wealthy men were taught early that weakness invited collapse. Richard Whitmore had survived boardroom wars, hostile takeovers, political scandals, and public pressure without ever losing composure. Yet the voice of one frightened little boy destroyed him in seconds. Clara quietly stepped closer, but still kept distance between them. "He loved you very much," she whispered. Richard shook his head slowly, tears finally slipping down his face. "I was not there." The words barely came out. Clara's expression softened with heartbreaking sadness. "You tried." Richard let out a hollow laugh. "No," he stared at the cassette player like it was evidence in a trial against his soul. "I scheduled my son between meetings." The tape continued spinning. Ethan's weak breathing filled the room again. Then came another soft sentence almost drowned by static. "Dad hears this one day." Richard looked up instantly. Ethan inhaled shakily before finishing. "Please tell him I waited for him until I could not stay awake anymore." The room went completely silent. Even the rain outside seemed to disappear. Richard Whitmore sat frozen beside the old cassette player while the truth he had spent years outrunning finally caught him. Some truths do not arrive like explosions. They arrive quietly, in the voice of a child who spent his final nights waiting for someone too busy to notice he was disappearing. Richard Whitmore remained seated beside the cassette player long after Ethan's voice faded into static. The caretaker's office felt impossibly small now, the warm yellow light pressing against walls suddenly crowded with memories he could no longer escape. Outside, rain rolled steadily down the windows while distant thunder murmured over the cemetery hills. Clara stood near the doorway in complete silence, giving him the dignity to fall apart without witnesses, even after the way he had humiliated her beside Ethan's grave only an hour earlier. Richard slowly removed his glasses and covered his face with trembling hands. For 6 years, The billionaire had built his life around controlled grief. Charity galas in Ethan's name. Scholarship foundations. Hospital wings carrying the Whitmore legacy. Public speeches about resilience and hope. The entire country admired the grieving father who turned pain into philanthropy. But sitting in that tiny room beside an old cassette player, Richard realized something horrifying. He had spent millions memorializing his son while avoiding the unbearable truth of how lonely that boy actually felt before he died. Clara carefully stepped forward at last and placed a small paper cup of coffee near him without saying a word. Richard looked up slowly, his eyes red with exhaustion and shame. "Why did he trust you so much?" he asked quietly. Clara stared down at the floor for a moment before answering. "Because I listened when he was scared." Richard felt those words settle deep inside his chest. Listening. Such a simple thing. Yet somehow the billionaire who controlled corporations across 3 continents had failed at the one thing his son needed most. Clara sat carefully in the chair across from him, her movements slow and uncertain. "The nurses used to tell me Ethan pretended to sleep whenever doctors entered the room." Richard frowned faintly through the fog of emotion. "Why?" Clara's voice softened. "Because if he asked too many questions about dying, your wife would cry afterward." Richard lowered his eyes immediately. He remembered those nights now. Victoria locking herself inside hospital bathrooms to regain composure. Endless meetings with specialists. Carefully filtered conversations around Ethan to protect him from fear. They thought they were shielding their son from pain. Instead, Ethan learned to carry fear alone. Clara continued quietly. He worried more about everyone else than himself. Richard stared blankly toward the rain-covered window. Ethan had inherited that from his mother. Compassion without limits. Even during treatment, the boy sent thank you cards to nurses and shared toys with children too weak to leave their rooms. The memories came harder now, sharper, more painful. Richard suddenly remembered one particular video call during a conference in Singapore. Ethan had smiled weakly through pale lips and asked, "Are you coming home soon, Dad?" Richard promised he would. But another negotiation delayed his flight. Then another interview. By the time he arrived back in Boston, Ethan had already stopped asking. The realization hollowed him out from the inside. Clara slowly reached into her bag and removed a folded stack of papers tied together with a blue ribbon. These were in Ethan's drawer after he passed. Richard looked down at the papers uncertainly. Children's handwriting covered the top page. The letters uneven and shaky from weakness. "He wrote a lot during treatments," Clara explained softly. "Mostly thoughts, questions, little stories." Richard's fingers trembled as he carefully unfolded the first page. The date written in the corner stopped his breathing immediately. It was from the week he missed Ethan's final surgery. He read silently while rain tapped against the windows behind him. "Today Clara taught me how to find Orion's belt through hospital glass. She says stars still exist even when clouds hide them. I think people are like that too." Richard shut his eyes painfully. Clara looked away to give him privacy, but nothing could soften the damage unfolding inside him now. Another page slipped loose into his lap. This one carried only one sentence written carefully in blue marker. "Dad keeps saying he will come soon. I hope he does not feel bad if he misses it." Richard's composure shattered again, pressed trembling fingers against his mouth as tears slid freely down his face. Not dramatic tears, not loud grief, just the quiet collapse of a man finally confronting the cost of his own absence. Across from him, Clara fought tears of her own before speaking softly into the silence. "He never hated you, Richard." The billionaire looked up slowly. Clara's voice cracked gently as she continued. "That was the heartbreaking part. He understood you even while you were breaking his heart." The room went completely silent again. Then Richard looked down at the final folded paper still resting beneath the others and noticed something written across the front in Ethan's shaky handwriting. "For Dad. Only when he is finally ready." Richard Whitmore had spent his entire life believing readiness was something powerful men controlled, but the trembling letter in his hands proved grief arrived on its own schedule. The caretaker's office remained silent except for the distant sound of rain sliding across the cemetery windows. Clara sat quietly across from him, her exhausted eyes lowered while Richard stared at the final folded page Ethan had left behind 6 years earlier. "For Dad. Only when he is finally ready." The billionaire's fingers shook as he carefully unfolded the paper. The edges were worn from time, as though Clara had carried it close for years without ever opening it herself. Richard noticed faint blue stains near the bottom of the page, places where water had once blurred the ink. Tears, perhaps, or hospital spills. Either way, the letter looked fragile enough to fall apart if held too tightly. Richard swallowed hard before beginning to read. Hi, Dad. I know Clara said I should write something happy, but I think maybe honest is better. Richard's breathing slowed immediately. Ethan's uneven handwriting carried the same innocent sincerity that once filled birthday cards and refrigerator notes back when life still felt simple. The billionaire kept reading while the room around him faded into silence. I know you love me. I never thought you did not. But sometimes when people love really hard, they think working more is the same thing as being there. Richard closed his eyes painfully. The sentence struck with impossible precision because Ethan somehow understood him better at 12 years old than most adults ever had. Richard Whitmore built his empire from nothing. Poverty shaped him young. His father died working double shifts at a steel plant, while his mother struggled to keep electricity running through brutal Boston winters. Richard promised himself early that his future family would never suffer the insecurity he endured growing up. So he chased success relentlessly. Every missed birthday dinner, every delayed vacation, every late-night phone call inside hospital corridors had always carried the same justification. I am doing this for them. But now Ethan's handwriting quietly exposed the flaw in that belief. Richard continued reading with trembling hands. I used to wait for your footsteps outside my hospital room every night. When nurses walked past the door, I always hoped one of them would be you. The billionaire stopped breathing for a moment entirely. Clara quietly wiped tears from her face, while Richard stared blankly at the words. He remembered those nights now with unbearable clarity. Private jets, hotel suites, negotiations stretching past midnight, while his son stared toward hospital doors hoping his father would appear. Ethan's letter continued. But I stopped being angry after Clara told me something important. She said adults get lost too, especially the ones trying hardest not to fail everybody. Richard lowered the paper slowly. Tears slid freely down his face now. Not because Ethan blamed him. That would have hurt less somehow. No, the true devastation came from realizing his son had spent his final weeks comforting everyone else instead of being comforted himself. Clara looked toward the rain-covered windows as Richard forced himself to continue. Dad, if you are reading this, it means Clara finally thought you were ready to hear the truth. I did not need a perfect father. I just needed more time with mine. The room fell completely silent again. Richard pressed one shaking hand against his mouth as grief tore through him in waves too powerful to contain anymore. His entire life, people feared disappointing Richard Whitmore. Employees, politicians, investors, entire companies collapsed under the pressure of his expectations. Yet none of those failures compared to the quiet heartbreak inside one sentence written by a dying 12-year-old boy. Richard kept reading through blurred vision. I know you thought money could fix scary things. But when nights got really bad, I did not care about any of that stuff. I just wanted somebody to stay until I fell asleep. Clara softly covered her eyes with trembling fingers. Richard finally understood why she kept returning to the cemetery all these years. She was not protecting a secret. She was protecting Ethan's memory from becoming another polished public story. Because the truth was far less comfortable. A little boy with unlimited medical care still died feeling lonely sometimes. Richard reached the final lines of the letter. Please do not be mad at Clara. She stayed when everybody else had to leave. And Dad, if you still feel guilty someday, maybe instead of building things with my name on them, just stay for people more. The billionaire's composure collapsed entirely then. He lowered his head into both hands as silent sobs shook through him for the first time since the funeral. Across from him, Clara whispered softly through tears of her own. He made me promise you would read that only after grief stopped making you angry. Richard slowly looked up at her, broken and exhausted. And what changed? Clara stared at him with heartbreaking gentleness before answering. Today was the first time you finally listened instead of defended yourself. The room went silent once more. Then Richard looked back down at the bottom of Ethan's letter and noticed one final sentence written smaller than the others, almost hidden beneath the fold. P. Ethan's letter still rested in his trembling hands while silence settled heavily between him and Clara Bennett. Outside, the gray afternoon sky slowly brightened through drifting clouds, But inside that small room, the billionaire felt like a man standing in the ruins of his own carefully constructed life. For years, Richard believed grief was something time eventually organized into neat compartments. Work helped. Public admiration helped. Charity projects helped. But Ethan's words had shattered that illusion completely, because grief did not disappear when ignored. It waited quietly beneath success until truth finally forced it into the light. Clara slowly stood from her chair and reached for her coat. "I should go," she whispered softly. Richard immediately looked up. Panic flickered across his exhausted face before he could hide it. "Wait." Clara paused near the doorway, but did not turn around yet. Richard struggled to steady his breathing. "Why did you keep all of this alone for 6 years?" Clara closed her eyes briefly before answering. "'Cause Ethan asked me to protect you." Richard stared at her in disbelief. "Protect me?" Clara finally turned back toward him, tears shining in her tired blue eyes. "He knew you blamed yourself already." The billionaire lowered his gaze immediately. He was right. Clara shook her head softly. "No, you failed in some ways. But Ethan never wanted guilt to become the only thing left of him." Those words settled deeply inside the room. Richard realized then that Clara had been carrying far more than memories all these years. She had been carrying Ethan's final wishes alone, while the world celebrated Richard Whitmore as a grieving father who supposedly overcame loss with dignity and strength. The room fell silent again. Clara looked away, her fingers tightening around the strap of her worn leather bag. Richard noticed then how exhausted she looked. Not physically, emotionally. Like someone who had spent years grieving in private while watching the world misunderstand the boy she loved. "Why did you keep visiting his grave?" Richard asked quietly. Clara's eyes drifted toward the cemetery windows. "Because I promised him nobody would forget who he really was." Richard frowned faintly. "What do you mean?" Clara swallowed hard before answering. "The world remembers Ethan Whitmore as the billionaire's son who inspired hospital donations. For years, he unknowingly turned his son into something polished and public because that version hurt less to face. But Clara had protected the real Ethan, the frightened little boy who counted footsteps outside hospital rooms and stared at stars through glass windows at 2 in the morning. Richard slowly walked toward her. No arrogance remained in him now. No billionaire confidence. Just a grieving father stripped down to truth. "I cannot change what I missed," he whispered. Clara's expression softened gently. No, Richard's eyes filled again. "Then what do I do now?" Clara looked at him for a long moment before answering. "You stay?" Richard frowned slightly through the emotion. Clara's voice remained soft but steady. "Stay for people when it is inconvenient. Stay when work feels more important. Stay when grief gets uncomfortable. Stay the way Ethan needed." The words landed quietly but carried more weight than any business lesson Richard Whitmore had ever learned. Clara moved toward the door again, but before leaving, she reached carefully into her bag one final time and removed a small folded photograph. Richard took it slowly. The image nearly stopped his heart. Ethan lay in his hospital bed wearing oversized pajamas covered in tiny planets, while Clara sat beside him reading from an astronomy book. But what shattered Richard completely was Ethan's expression. His son was smiling. Truly smiling. Not for cameras. Not to comfort worried adults. Just smiling peacefully beside someone who made him feel less alone. Richard's lips trembled as he stared at the photo. "I have not seen him look that happy in years," he whispered. Clara's eyes filled with tears again. That was the night he finally stopped being afraid of the dark. The room went silent once more. Then Richard looked up slowly at the woman he had humiliated beside his son's grave only hours earlier and realized something devastating. Clara Bennett had given Ethan something all the billionaire's money never could. Presents. 1 year later, the people of Boston noticed something strange about Richard Whitmore. The billionaire who once measured his life in schedules, acquisitions, and private flights had quietly disappeared from magazine covers and business conferences. Invitations to elite charity galas were politely declined. Television interviews stopped completely. Even board meetings became shorter because Richard no longer stayed after hours chasing deals that once felt more important than everything else. Instead, on Thursday evenings, a black sedan could often be seen parked outside St. Matthew Children's Hospital long after sunset. Nurses whispered about it at first. Parents noticed too. Richard Whitmore walked the pediatric floors carrying astronomy books beneath one arm and paper cups of hot chocolate in his hands. No cameras followed him anymore. No reporters were invited. He sat beside frightened children through difficult nights because 6 years too late, a dying little boy had finally taught him what presence really meant. The hospital wing named after Ethan still existed, but Richard quietly removed the giant bronze plaque bearing the Whitmore family name from the lobby. In its place appeared a smaller inscription engraved into plain white marble. In honor of those who stay. Most visitors walked past without understanding the meaning. Clara Bennett understood immediately the first time she saw it. The winter after their meeting at the cemetery passed slowly. Richard visited Clara often at the small bookstore where she worked near the edge of downtown Boston. At first their conversations were awkward, heavy with grief neither fully knew how to navigate. But over time something softer replaced the silence between them. Not romance. Not obligation. Just two broken people carrying the memory of the same child in different ways. Clara showed Richard Ethan's favorite astronomy sketches. Richard shared stories about the boy learning to ride a bicycle in their old driveway. Sometimes they laughed unexpectedly. Sometimes they cried. But for the first time since Ethan's death, neither of them grieved alone anymore. One snowy evening in December, Richard arrived at the bookstore carrying a carefully wrapped box beneath his coat. Clara looked up from organizing shelves as the little bell above the door chimed softly. "You are late," she teased gently. Richard smiled faintly. Traffic. Clara noticed something different about him these days. The sharp edges had softened. The constant urgency disappeared from his eyes. Wealth no longer sat on his shoulders like armor. Richard placed the box carefully on the counter. "I found something while cleaning storage at the house." Clara slowly opened the package and froze instantly. Inside rested Ethan's old telescope, polished carefully despite years of dust. Tears filled Clara's eyes immediately. "I thought this was gone." Richard shook his head softly. "I could not look at it before." Clara touched the telescope gently, like something sacred. Richard reached into his coat pocket and removed the silver compass Ethan once carried through hospital nights. "I think he would want you to have this too." Clara's breath caught. "Richard," but the billionaire shook his head again. "He already helped me find my way home." The bookstore fell silent except for soft jazz music drifting through old ceiling speakers. Outside, snow moved gently beneath glowing streetlights. Clara looked down at the compass resting in her palm, while tears slipped quietly down her cheeks. "He would be happy you finally listened," she whispered. Richard looked toward the bookstore windows thoughtfully. No, his voice carried quiet humility now. He would be happy someone finally taught me how. Several days later, on the anniversary of Ethan's passing, Richard returned once more to St. Gabriel Memorial Cemetery. The winter air felt calmer this year somehow. Less cruel. 2 bouquets rested beneath Ethan's grave when he arrived. One carried Richard's name. The other carried Clara's. But what stopped him cold was the small scene unfolding nearby. A frightened little boy stood crying beside his mother near another grave several rows away. The child looked no older than 8. Clara knelt beside him calmly, speaking softly while helping him hold a single white flower against his chest. Richard watched silently as the boy's breathing slowly steadied. After a moment, Clara pointed gently toward the cloudy evening sky above the cemetery. The child looked up, listening carefully while she spoke. Richard already knew what she was telling him. Stars still exist, even when clouds hide them. The billionaire stood there quietly for a long time, hands buried inside his coat pockets while cold wind moved through the cemetery trees overhead. Then his eyes drifted back toward Ethan's grave, and the faint smile finally appearing on his face carried no wealth, no status, no performance. Only understanding. Because on the hardest day of his life, a simple woman had taught him something his empire never could. Love is not measured by power, money, or promises about tomorrow. Love is measured by who stays when staying becomes difficult.